Well, good evening and a very warm welcome to you all. It's really lovely to see you and to have the really good atmosphere here for Monia. Monia's topic this evening is Writing in Exile, Kindertransport Diaries and the Making of New Lives. And I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing her this evening. This is really special. She is a researcher specializing in exile studies and cultural exchange at the University of London's Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies, as I'm sure you all know here. She's also winner of the 2024 Sylvia Nash Lecture and Bissell Fellow in German Studies at the ILCS. Her work focuses on memory studies, transnationalism, and ego documents, very interesting name, in the context of German and Austrian exile studies. And we're very proud of her achievements here. And it's tremendous that she is now presenting this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jana. Let me just set up my presentation.
And please feel welcome to say what you wanted to say.
Yes, I will. Yeah, thank you, Jana, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be back again once more here at the ILCS. I want to thank you all for coming, for joining me tonight here in the room, but also online. I hope everyone can hear us. If not, please pop something in the chat. And first and foremost, I want to thank the Martin Miller and Hannah Robert Miller Trust for funding my PhD research. Without them and the support of the studentship, this research would have not been possible. And I also want to thank all the members from the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies for the input and guidance over the last 4 years. And I'm very delighted to continue my work with you. Before I start my talk, I want to mention a couple of things. So the diaries were mainly written in German, some in English, but as I want to keep this talk primarily in English, I have included my own translations on the slides, and I will use these translations. But you will see the German quotes where applicable, either as a picture or I've also put them on the slides. And for everyone here or anyone in the room or online who's able to speak and write German, please do feel free to ask me questions about the German aspects as well if you notice anything. Then what else did I want to say? Many of the diary entries that I use as examples can be used for multiple aspects that I'm discussing, but I'm just focusing on one specific aspect at a time. But again, if you see something that you would like to do. Right. January 1939. Dear Diary, you must now be very discreet, for I want to tell you all the hidden joys and sorrows of the depths of my heart. Don't worry if I don't tell you everything daily, because to me, you're not just a diary, but a person I can tell everything to. I will do my best to tell you only good things, my secret book. End quote. Elisabeth Bornstein wrote these words just weeks or even days before arriving in England on what we now know as the Kindertransports. Like nearly 10,000 other, mainly Jewish children, the 11-year-old girl from Vienna had to leave her parents behind. This entry, which is the beginning of her diary, tells us a lot about how she intends to use the diary. By speaking to the diary as if it were a person, a friend who can keep secrets, Elisabeth intends to create something precious, a space that belongs entirely to her at a time when she faced a lot of change. And we know she was aware of these changing circumstances since the Kindertransport must have been imminent. We can also see a dedication from the person who gifted Elisabeth the diary in the top corner of the image. It was her nanny, and she said, as a farewell gift, I'm giving you this diary. But now back to the content. Notice how she promises to tell only good things, a touching glimpse of a child trying to stay positive while facing enormous challenges. Yet the very need to make this promise hints at something more difficult beneath the surface. Elisabeth's life story was one of multiple uprootings. From Vienna, she was sent to Frankfurt and then back to Vienna again before boarding a train to London. Then she was evacuated to the Buckinghamshire countryside to the village of Brief after the war broke out. And eventually she joined her parents again in Buffalo before retiring in Peterborough, Ontario in Canada. While some might argue that her story had a happy ending when she was reunited with her parents and brother Georg in the autumn of 1940, her diary tells a much more nuanced story of the struggles of displacement, adaptation, and belonging. And more generally, what these diaries, not just Elisabeth's, but the other 8 that I looked at reveal is that the Kindertransport experience was far more complex than a simple journey from danger to safety. Each diary tells a story of multiple transitions: geographical, linguistic, cultural, and emotional. But before I start, I want to take a look at the diaries. And if I start with taking a look at the diaries, I want to give a brief overview of the Kindertransport scheme. While I'm sure many of us here know the historical context, I want to just sketch out some of the main points. The Kindertransport emerged as a direct response to the escalating persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany and occupied territories. Following Kristallnacht in November 1938, when Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were destroyed across Germany and Austria, Jewish aid and refugee organizations and individuals in Britain proposed to make migration easier for refugees from German territories. While the British government agreed to waive visa requirements for unaccompanied children up to the age of 17, there were strict conditions. Each child needed a £50 guarantee. And to put this into context, that's roughly equivalent to £3,000 today, to ensure that they wouldn't become a burden to the state. Private citizens and organisations had to arrange their housing and education, and most crucially, parents were not permitted to accompany their children. The first transport arrived in Harwich on the 2nd of December 1938. Over the next few months, until the war broke out in September 1939 and the transports had to stop, nearly 10,000 children were brought to Britain. These children came primarily from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. They were placed across Britain, some with foster families, others in hostels or on farms. Many ended up being evacuated again when war broke out, just like Elisabeth, adding another layer of displacement their experience. It became evident as the war continued that further migration of the child refugees was not possible for the foreseeable future. However, the fact that most refugees to Britain were children had its benefits for the British government and, as they thought, for society, because children were considered more malleable than adults. Yet, this assumption that children would be more easily assimilated to British culture that was established by the government in the late 1930s omits the struggles and challenges individuals faced during exile, migration, and displacement. So today, I want to share with you the stories of 9 young refugees who documented their lives through their diaries that show exactly that it wasn't as easy or straightforward as the government might have made it out to be. These personal accounts offer a unique window into the Kindertransport experience, not through the lens of adults or historians, but through the eyes of the children themselves. Let me introduce them briefly. We've already met Elisabeth Ornstein at the beginning of this talk. She was 11 years old when she left Vienna in January 1939. Kurt and Fritz Selig were brothers, aged 8 and 14 when they left from Berlin on separate Kindertransport, and they were placed in separate families. Ilse Grünwald was 14 when she left Vienna in December 1938. Helga Beer was 12 when she arrived in England with her sister Irene. They were both taken in by the Attenborough family, who lived in Leicester at the time. Edith Jakobowitz, aged 15 when she left Berlin, was sent to Northern Ireland to live at Millal Refugee Farm in County Down with her 11-year-old brother Georg. Leopold Weil was 14 when he arrived in England in August 1939. Originally from Karlsruhe, he attended boarding school in Milan and wrote his early diary entries in Italian. Ingeborg Ziegler was born in Chemnitz. She was 12 when she arrived in England just weeks before war broke out. Her brother also arrived on a separate Kindertransport and was placed elsewhere. And lastly, Hannah Weinberger from Hof in Bavaria was 13 when she arrived in England. She lived in Bristol with a teacher. Their diaries are held at various archives, including the Wiener Holocaust Library here in London, just around the corner, the Imperial War Museum, as well as the Center for Jewish History and the Leo Baeck Institute in New York, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. What makes these sources particularly valuable is their immediacy. Unlike memoirs written years later or histories collected in old age, these diaries capture the children's experiences as they happened. They show us not just what these children remembered, but what they thought important enough to record at the time. And these kinds of sources are becoming ever more important as we progress from the lived memory of the Holocaust to it entering cultural and historical memory. When I first started this research project in September 2020, I was considering in what way I would approach these diaries. With the research question of how they negotiated belonging and narrated their lives in mind, I decided to look at the diaries from various different angles. Since the diaries vary significantly in form and content, I had to evaluate which angles to choose. Some are carefully crafted documents with drawings and newspaper clippings. Others are simple notebooks filled with daily observations. Some children wrote in German, others in English, and many switched between languages as time went on. So what is the best way to deal with these kinds of resources? Well, surprisingly, there's no all-encompassing answer, but rather many different ways to read and investigate ego documents such as diaries. There's the act of diary writing itself. How do they write and why? Then there's the question of belonging. How did the Kindertransport refugees see themselves? Memory and the act of remembering informs most of their entries. And it wasn't just about nostalgia. The use of memory allows us to see how they make sense of their present through past experiences. Language also plays a fascinating role and shows us the integration and adaptation process in real time. And finally, the diary is a product of the everyday itself. And therefore, we also need to look at the daily, the ordinary, and the mundane that they write about. But also, since the war was unfolding around them, the extraordinary circumstances they found themselves in. Based on the 5 chapters of my thesis, I have conceptualized this talk to also look at these aspects. We're first going to look at diary writing as a practice, then forms and expressions of belonging or non-belonging, and then we move on to the use of memory briefly, and then I will briefly touch on language in the diaries, but because I want to keep this talk mainly in English, I'm just going to gloss over it, and then the representation of the everyday. The examples that I've chosen for this talk are just that, examples. Each diary has many more entries covering similar content and emotions, and trends become visible throughout them. But let's have a look. One of the first questions I asked myself was, why do they write? What are their motivations and reasons for starting their diaries? So in general, diary writing as a practice can serve many purposes. It can construct narratives and identities. It can be an attempt to give coherence to a life or serve as an autobiographical act of self-expression. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Here's Ilse's very first diary entry from January 1935. She received her diary on her 11th birthday on January the 6th, and she writes, and I quote, finally, my long-awaited wish has come true. I got you, my dear diary, today for my 11th birthday. I can tell everything to you, all my sorrows and joys. End quote. Notice how she creates an immediate relationship with her diary, addressing it as my liebes Tagebuch, my dear diary. This wasn't just a childish personification. By creating what scholar Desiree Henderson calls a distinct identity, Ilse established a bond with what would become a crucial outlet during her years in exile. For Ilse, but also for Elisabeth, as we've seen at the beginning of this talk, the diary served as a friend and confidant, as a safe space to share their secrets. Their intention to use the diary as a space for themselves allowed Ilse and Elisabeth to be truthful about their joys and sorrows, something that seemed to become ever more important as the war continued, and they were able to write about their emotions rather than bottling them up when they seemingly had no one else to turn to. But not every child approached their diary as a confidant or friend. Let me show you a very different example. Here's Fritz Selig's very first entry, written on 19th of April, 1939, the day he left Germany on a Kindertransport. And I quote, departure from Berlin, Schlesischer Bahnhof, with transport, 50 children, at 8:47 a.m. on a D train. Our carriage was unhooked in Bentheim. We stood there for 2 hours. Onward journey with FD train. Arrival in Hoek van Holland, 22:40. End quote. What's fascinating here is that what Fritz doesn't write. No emotions, no reflections. Just times, places, and facts. Well, the railway timetable almost. Departure from Berlin at 8:47 a.m., arrival in Hoek van Holland 22:40. Fritz was 14 when he had to leave everything he knew behind. Yet, he writes with almost clinical detachment. This tells us something crucial about diary writing during crisis. These seemingly emotionless entries were themselves a coping mechanism, a way to impose order on chaos, to make overwhelming experiences manageable by reducing them to simple facts and figures. Both brothers actually began their diaries at moments of profound upheaval. Fritz, on the day of his Kindertransport, Kurt during the evacuation to the British countryside. But instead of pouring out their feelings, Fritz in particular records events with careful precision. This shows that diaries are not just a friend, but they can take on other functions, such as becoming a witness to significant historical change and a mode to track particular developments. And this tracking of developments can happen in different ways. They can track historical events, as we've just seen, but also use the diary to watch themselves change and grow. Let me show you an example from 15-year-old Leopold Weil's diary. In September 1940, Leopold rereads his earlier entries and writes, and I quote, "I have now reread the first pages of my diary, and I have the feeling that I must present my excuses to the world, that it was possible for me to have ideas for the childish and idiots. I'm referring to my fear that I would not be able to become a farmer, to my ideas in general. I can see it with a clarity that I did not know existed before." End quote. Leopold isn't just recording daily events. He's actively engaging with his past self, critiquing his former thoughts and beliefs. The diary has become what scholar Philippe Lejeune calls a mirror, a way to step back and see yourself change over time. Notice how Leopold writes as if addressing an audience beyond himself, or maybe perhaps his future self. He feels like he must present excuses to the world. This shows how these young refugees were also conscious of straddling multiple worlds, their past and their present, and even a future, as well as their old and new identities. For writing and rereading his old diary entries, Leopold was able to track his own growth and change, and critically examine his past thoughts. But more generally in this entry, but also in multiple other entries across the 9 diaries, I was actually able to see that no matter what their intentions, they were all able to use the diary as a mode to attempt to create coherent narratives from their fragmented experiences. In a time when their identities were profoundly challenged by exile, the simple act of keeping a diary became a powerful tool for maintaining a sense of self and identity. Through writing, they weave together past, present, and an uncertain future into something that made sense to them. So despite having just mentioned this interplay between past and present, I want to emphasize this clear before and after, life in the old country versus life in the new one, that we think refugee stories might have is not as clear as it first seems. When we look closely at these diaries, we discover something far more complex. For these children, belonging wasn't just about geography. It wasn't as simple as leaving one home and finding another. It was about navigating varied senses of belonging, not just national, but beyond that, the affective dimension of belonging, feeling and longing. Let me give you an example from Elisabeth's diary. Here she is in April 1940, walking and singing a German folk song called Nun ade, du mein lieb Heimatland, farewell, my dear homeland. She writes, "When I reached the last verse, I broke into tears." But look at how she writes this entry. And I'm afraid I have to switch a bit into German right now. So while expressing the homesickness through a traditional German folk song, she uses distinct anglicized ways of writing. So notice how in her German writing, she would say, and I'll show that here in the red into Tränen. So obviously you notice she's using an English word here, and I circle it here as well. And what you can also see, and this is very interesting, she writes mainly the whole entry in this neat German cursive called Sütterlin. So very hard to read. Even if you don't read German, you can see that this is a bit different than normal cursive handwriting. And then for the title, but also for the intro, the single English word that she uses, she switches into another handwriting. So the song is also very telling. So written in 1848, it's about someone choosing to leave their homeland. But Elizabeth didn't choose. The choice was made for her, yet she finds meanings in the lyrics of the final farewell. This single entry shows us that belonging is something more than just a geographical idea. Belonging is something that can be expressed through everyday choices like language, songs, or script. And it's a state that can hold contradictions, longing for a home while adapting to new customs. In this case, we can see this expressed through this language and script change. This is the paradox of the refugee experience, is creating new forms of belonging while processing the loss of the old. Through writing, these children weren't choosing between past and present identities. They were crafting something entirely new that could hold both, but also extend beyond the geographical binaries, and weave itself into forms of linguistic and cultural belonging, becoming something dynamic and fluid. Having said this, especially in the earlier weeks and months of prison, forming new attachments and learning forms of belonging wasn't easy. Many children and teenagers felt distraught and homesick, and the trauma of the separation from their parents and their displacement is visible throughout their diaries. First, there's homesickness, but not just as we might imagine. Look at Ilse's diary, which is held at the Wiener Library. In her first entry after arriving in England in January 1939, she writes, "I am now here in England and cannot imagine that the whole sea is separating me from Vienna." Notice how she focuses on the physical distance, the vast sea between her and home. But her homesickness isn't just about these geographical dimensions. And we can see this at multiple occasions in her diary, but I'm choosing a quote from 4th September 1939, when she writes, and I quote, "When will I see my Mutti again? I always get terribly homesick for her." So here we can see homesickness transforming into something more specific, the profound loss of a family connection. This tells us something vital about the refugee experience. It's not just about leaving a place geographically, but about it being separated from the people who make a place a home. Now look at this entry from April 1939, just 5 months after her arrival in Britain. She writes, and I quote, "I'm terribly disappointed with London and the English. I have never come across such a simple-minded and stupid people. They pray and eat all day long. That's their life and that's how we should lead it. I'd rather die. When they pray all day, it just repels me because I can't take it seriously. And they're so terribly old-fashioned in everything." This fierce rejection of her new home isn't just teenage dramatics. It is something more than that. It's creating an us versus them divide. By criticizing what she sees as English habits and customs, 15-year-old Ilse is actually expressing something deeper. Her struggle to maintain her own sense of identity in a very alien environment. These entries remind us that the Kindertransport story isn't one of rescue and gratitude. While Ilse's reaction might seem a bit extreme, many of these children struggled with similar feelings of displacement and loss, especially in these early months. The way they wrote about their struggles, through homesickness, through criticism, and through comparison, shows us how complex the process of making new lives and homes really is. But not all entries about negotiating belonging were about loss and separation. Let me show you something remarkable from Leopold's diary that reveals how these young refugees found new ways to belong. Here's what he writes in May 1942, and I quote, "Yes, the card games and gossip evenings that he attended before this entry has changed. In the first place, I owe it to young Austria. In the second place, to a certain bookshop in Whitechurch Street. And in the third place, to the fact that I live in decent conditions." End quote. Notice 3 elements he identifies here: a youth organization, a bookshop, and stable housing. Each represents a different aspect of belonging. Community through Young Austria, cultural connection or an intellectual connection through the bookshop, and security through proper housing. But what's even more fascinating is how he goes on in this entry. Leopold redefines the very concept of homeland or Heimat. When he describes Young Austria's mission, he writes, and I quote, "We are a group of camaraderie young people from 16 to our early 20s. Our aim is to rebuild our homeland, whatever country it may be, in the spirit of progress, peace, love, and comradeship, from the individual to the international." End quote. This is something revolutionary to Leopold. He transforms Heimat from a fixed place into something mobile, not tied to geography, but to shared values and experiences. He shows us that belonging doesn't have to mean choosing between past and present. Instead, it can mean creating something entirely new that bridges both worlds. Both examples, Leopold's but also Ilse's, have shown us that belonging and non-belonging often existed simultaneously in the experience of making new homes and navigating new lives for these refugees. While people develop connections through social bonds, shared experiences, and daily activities, they may also face moments of marginalization, homesickness, and cultural estrangement. This dynamic tension creates something complex. Hybrid identities where individuals had to navigate between integration and displacement, between past and present, and between familiar and unfamiliar circumstances. The process of making a new home is therefore not a simple journey from outsider to insider, but rather an ongoing negotiation of multiple identities and experiences that shaped how the Kindertransport refugees understood their place in the world. Memory and attachments to their country of origin play a vital role in the process of making new lives and establishing new forms of belonging, as we've just seen. I just want to remind us here also of the affective dimension that I mentioned earlier of belonging, that splits into being and longing, suggesting that when negotiating belonging, we always have our minds in the present as well as in the past. Ultimately, the role of memory in the Kindertransport Diaries reveals complex processes of meaning-making that go far beyond simple nostalgia or record-keeping. Their engagement with memory took multiple forms, each serving distinct psychological and narrative purposes in their attempts to make sense of their displacement. We see this complexity particularly clearly in Leopold's entry from 1939 about his final days in Germany, and I quote, "I hear a song, a troop of Hitler boys turn into the street. Always they must march and march and march again. It's nearly impossible to live. Every Jew must be afraid of a Hitler boy, as if for a very great guilt we were driven away from the community, outlawed. Yes, we are driven away like animals, but where's our guilt? Several months ago, we applied for emigration to England, Holland, or Sweden. And the first answer I shall go away from Germany, no matter what the country will be, only to be far from this hell." And then at the end of the very long entry, he also says, "But all we were happy to go on English and free ground." What makes this entry particularly fascinating is actually its layered temporality. Written in November about an August experience, copied from a school assignment in his non-native English, Leopold writes about this experience. This multi-mediation creates a rich text where memory serves several functions simultaneously. First, as a documentary evidence, his vivid description of the Hitler Youth march and march and march again uses memory to bear witness to the circumstances that forced his departure. The repetition isn't just a literary technique, it's an attempt to capture the relentless nature of the persecution he experienced. Second, memory functions as a justification. When he writes, "Yes, we were driven away like animals, but where's our guilt?" memory becomes a tool for processing the trauma and asserting his own clarity. He's not simply remembering, he's actively constructing a narrative that helps him understand his displacement as unjust rather than deserved. And thirdly, as memory functions as a marker of transformation. His description of Germany as hell is contrasted with England as free ground, showing how memory can serve to reinforce and justify the present circumstances he finds himself in when he's writing this entry. And just so as a reiteration, he writes this in November and backdates it to August 1939. However, memory could also work in different ways, as we can see in Ilse's writing. And I quote, "I'll never forget the Stadion bar, the swimming pool in Vienna, or the times when I thanked God that life was so wonderful. London always brings me new disappointments. I went swimming once and it was horrible. One of the nicest pools in Hampstead, and I'll never go again." End quote. This contrast reveals how memory in the diaries operates along several key aspects. There's a temporal orientation. It can be forward-looking, using memory to understand and adapt to new circumstances, but it also can be backward-looking, using memory to maintain connections to lost homes and identities. It can have an emotional function for processing trauma, converting raw experiences into comprehensible narratives, and for preserving identity, maintaining continuity of self despite displacement, and memory can serve narrative purposes. As a documentary, recording events, therapeutic, working through difficult experiences, or identity forming, using the memory to construct a new self-understanding. The examples show us two distinct but equally valid approaches to memory work, using memory to create distance and embrace the change, as in Leopold's entry, or using memory to maintain connections and resist assimilation, as Ilse does. Both approaches represent active strategies for coping with displacement rather than simple successful or unsuccessful adaptations. This suggests that the role of memory in refugee experiences is more complex than we might assume. It's not just about remembering or forgetting, but about actively using memory as a tool for making sense of change. Perhaps most significantly, these diary entries show us that memory isn't just about the past. It's a crucial tool for navigating the present and imagining possible futures. Understanding how refugee children navigated belonging through language also provides crucial insights into their adaptation experiences. Looking at the Kindertransport diaries reveals how young writers use language itself as a tool for processing change and constructing identities. Elisabeth, at age 12, made a conscious decision about her language use when she writes, and I quote, and this is from the entry on the left-hand side, "From now on, I will write in German or English, whatever I feel like, and keep you, my dear book, as a diary." The reason for this is that Britain, her history teacher, not Britain as in the country, told us that it's a good thing to keep a diary, and even if it comes difficult at first, one must make oneself right. End quote. Her choice to write whatever I feel like suggests that it wasn't merely about language practice. It was about creating a space where both of her identities could coexist. This is visually evident in her shift between Zitterlin, the German cursive script, and a more standard handwriting. So the entry before Easter Sunday 1940, and then the next entry, which is on 19th of April 1940, were both written in this German cursive Zitterlin, whereas this one, when she switches into English, again is written in normal handwriting. Later, she reveals another dimension to these language choices when in April 1940, she writes, and I quote, "A few days ago, I had a letter from Freuli, her nanny who gifted her the diary, in which she stated that she hoped I would write in my book as agreed. And so I began to feel remorseful, thought I must write in German every day in the future." End quote. This entry reveals how language choice were also tied to deeper questions of belonging and feelings of obligation. Even in this private space, Elisabeth's language use was shaped by her connection to others and her sense of duty to maintain these bonds. But she was also influenced by Britain to actually start writing in English, and then by Freuli, again to switch back into German. So these examples show us how language choice became more than a practical tool. It is a powerful mechanism for negotiating identity and belonging in exile. The linguistic practices of the young refugees in general reveal complex strategies of maintaining cultural connections while also adapting to new environments. Their creative use of language demonstrate both resilience and ingenuity in the face of displacement. The evolution of language in these diaries reveals a remarkable process of identity formation through writing. Let me share some particularly interesting examples of how these refugees found their distinctive voices, especially looking at how these young writers developed what I would now call translingual competencies, the ability to move fluidly between languages, not as separate systems, but as an integrated means of expression, shows this very clearly. We see fascinating instances of language hybridization, such as Ilse's repeated use of feda in her German entries from 1940 onwards. This wasn't just about vocabulary, it represents the emergence of a new way of expressing emotions that bridge both. Similarly, Ilse, as well as Ingeborg Fiedler, strategically switched between German and English in their entries, showing that her literature became more formality, public, and private. We have some examples here. That's from Ingeborg. She's talking about a guy and then switches into English because she's probably afraid that her Aunt Claire might be able to read it and thinking she can conceal this. And she said, but I do really like him. There's also Kurt Selig. When he writes about meeten, so to meet someone, he attempts to actually Germanize the English word to meet. We're witnessing here an active engagement with language learning through daily experiences, despite this word actually being a false friend, because mieten in German actually means to rent. So you see that he's sort of more aware of the English use of meet, and then he just makes this connection in his head. Obviously, false friend. And these patterns challenge traditional views of language transition as a simple progression towards individualism. They simply tell us how young refugees develop hybrid linguistic repertoire that reflected their evolving identities and help them navigate their new lives while making connections to their past. The language practices revealed in these refugee diaries demonstrate how young writers actively engage with adapting their abilities rather than actively experience displacement. Unconscious choices about when to use German or English, creating hybridizations of language and strategic switching between languages. These children were not just learning new ways to communicate, they were developing tools for processing their trauma, maintaining connections to their past, and also claiming spaces in their present. The concept of the everyday is crucial for understanding how Kindertransport refugees navigated and documented the experiences of displacement, as it helps us to understand both the exceptional and ordinary aspects of their lives. The everyday isn't just about routine activities, it's a complex interplay of three key elements. There's the ordinary, the routine aspects of daily life, such as going to school, chores, meeting up with friends. Then there's the extraordinary, the exceptional circumstances of war and displacement that they found themselves in. And then there's the repressive force of the everydayness, the structures and constraints that could limit our agency. What makes these Kindertransport diaries particularly fascinating is how they reveal the paradox of the refugee experience. Despite their extraordinary circumstances, many refugees maintain relatively ordinary lives. Through their daily entries, we see both ordinary moments, complaining about English food, excitement about going to the cinema, struggles with homework, and extraordinary ones, air raids, news from home, and the outbreak of war. Diary writing itself becomes significant as an everyday practice because it served multiple functions. It was a way to process both ordinary and extraordinary experience, as we can see on these in the examples on the slide. It's a tool for maintaining connections with family. It's a space where refugees could exercise agency in how they represented their experiences, and a record of how war and displacement became normalized in daily life. Let me show this on some examples. The first example I want to draw your attention to is from Hannah Weinberger's diary. She writes on 18 September 1941, and I quote, "Today we had our first geography lesson, and neither Mrs. Lamb nor the class liked the fact that there's only one geography lesson in the whole week. We were told that we are now allowed to use the library if we have any free periods. How grown up that sounds." So what might seem like a mundane entry about a geography lesson is actually an expression of excitement about her new situation. She's enjoying a subject and she is excited about having progressed to the senior level at school. Her pride in being allowed in the library during free periods highlights how ordinary experiences can be seen as something valuable and exciting, and give us a glimpse about how relatively ordinary lives they led. Let's look at another example. Helga Beer mainly writes about ordinary and sometimes even mundane aspects, highlighting her everyday experiences. On the 3rd of January, in 3 consecutive years, she writes, and her diary is mainly kept in English, so that's why there's no translation here. In 1944, she writes, "Dull life. I shall never really be happy in this house. Patricia makes me fed up." In 1945, she writes, "Nothing special. Did housework in the morning as usual, sorted picture post. Drama pictures. Helped Auntie with coffee in the afternoon. Joy is coming to tea tomorrow. In morning, Auntie and I are buying clothes." And in 1946, she writes, "Had hair permed. Was there from 2:30 to 6:30. Mrs. Hinchcliffe was sweet, gave me Christmas cake and tea. Freezing cold weather." Helga's entries, with their matter-of-fact recording of daily chores, might seem mundane, but they reveal how routine activities could help create continuity. Her repeated phrases, which you won't be able to see on the slide, but just sort of throughout the diary, like "nothing special" or "dull life," actually show something quite special. the successful creation of ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances. These ordinary moments weren't just fillers between major events. They were the very substance of navigating their lives. When Hannah writes about her school days or Helga details her boredom and daily chores, they're not just complaining about this or writing about their excitement. They're negotiating the situation and experiences within the context of their new lives. Despite them living relatively ordinary lives, many of them faced issues with their status as refugees and more generally with the repressive forces of the everyday caused by the uncertainty of the war. This is something seemingly simple, having nothing to do. Let me show you how this played out in the diaries. For example, in this remarkable entry from Ilse, written on September 4th, 1939, the day after after war was declared. And I quote the English translation, and you only have like a little excerpt here, but I'm going to leave out a bit of a longer thing because the diary entry is actually 2.5 pages long. I quote, "Some news. I haven't been with the Myers for 11 days. The committee suddenly decided that I wasn't allowed to live with boys anymore because of some nasty, unfounded gossip about Wally and me. People have no other worries. By the way, I kissed him on the forehead a few times. He kissed me too. When he drove away, he asked for a goodbye kiss, which he didn't get, as if he'd known that he would never see me again. Now I'm right in the centre of town, in a kind of boarding house. I have a nice room on my own at the moment, but others will come later. They are all Viennese here, and I'm going to forget all my English. Here, I get 2 shillings a week. I don't know if I'll get any later, and I have nothing to do except for my room. I still sit around with the other girls who have nothing to do. Once I went to the Austria Club, and there was nothing going on. And now, the most important thing. It's been war since yesterday. I still can't believe it. London will be the first city to be bombed. Maybe I'll die. I feel a bit sorry. If I stay alive, what will I have of my youth? The war will last many, many years, and then my best years will be gone, and I'll be old and grey. I already look like 20 from all the worries and thinking." End quote. So, as I said, the entry is 2.5, 3 pages long, and only sort of 1.5 pages in, she actually starts mentioning the war. This ordering, though, isn't accidental. Notice how she weaves together 3 levels of displacement. She starts with a personal displacement, the committee deciding that she had to move, that she wasn't allowed to live with boys anymore. Then the social displacement, moving from one place to another, leaving friends behind, but also being back with all the Viennese people, but at the same time worrying that she will forget all her English. And then there's a historical displacement, the fear of London being the first city to be bombed and maybe dying. There is a sense of loss of agency and inactivity in her entry. She says, "Here I get 2 shillings a week. I have nothing to do except my room. I still sit around with the other girls who have nothing to do. Once went to the Austria Club and there was nothing going on." She's trapped in a cruel paradox, facing potentially world-changing events while being denied an active role in shaping her own life. Well, let's look at another example. 15-year-old Edith writes in May 1940, and I quote, "Now it's time for me to sit at home again. I don't have a permit and therefore can't work. All I want to do is take the children for a walk. As I said, I'm back at home. If I don't get the permit, I'll probably have to go to the farm. That's not so bad at this time. In the meantime, Hitler has taken Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Since he isn't disturbed, it's possible that one day we'll have enemy planes here too." Notice her frustration. She can't even get a permit to work as a nanny. The bureaucracy of refugee life forced these young people into what I call enforced inactivity. They wanted to work, they wanted to contribute, they wanted to actively build their lives, but weren't able to. This enforced inactivity had profound effects. It disrupted their ability to create daily routines. It prevented them from developing a form of independence. It left them stuck between past and future, and it made even simple activities sometimes feel meaningless. But these young people actually weren't passive victims. Through their diary writing itself, they found a way to maintain agency. Even when writing about inactivity, they were actively processing this experience and resisting the emptiness of the days. What makes these accounts so powerful is how they show the subtle ways exile worked, not just through dramatic moments of loss, but also through the quiet violence of enforced waiting, of being denied work, of having to be inactive. The ways in which Kindertransport refugees wrote about danger and violence in their diaries also reveals a complex process of normalization of how the extraordinary becomes ordinary through daily exposure. Their entries show not just adaptation to new circumstances, but the active work of making sense of a world where air raids and invasion reports existed alongside ice cream outings or birthday celebrations. This interweaving of the ordinary and extraordinary in their writing gives us unique insights into how young refugees processed and documented their changing reality. Take Ingeborg's Sunday entry, for example. In August and September 1940, she maintains a regularity writing about air raids and daily experiences. And I quote from 1st of September 1940. Today is Sunday. There's an air raid going on. There have been at least 3 air raids a day this week. For example, the night before last, there were so many explosions that we went under the stairs for a while. Once in the afternoon, there was a German and 2 English planes just above our house, and I covered my ears. End quote. Her casual mention of an ongoing air raid in this entry, as if merely noting the weather, shows how these young refugees adapted to their new reality. Life-threatening events become woven into their routine, hiding under stairs, covering ears from flights overhead, all recorded with the same straightforward tone used to describe homework or tea time that she uses in her other entries. Through this act of writing, Ingeborg creates a narrative of her exile experience where even the most extraordinary dangers are transformed into ordinary occurrences. Her diary becomes both a chronicle of historical events and a tool for processing her displacement, helping her construct a version of normality in her adopted country where air raids are just another part of a Sunday. Now look at Kurt Selig's entry from 9th of April 1940. On his 11th birthday. He writes, and I quote, "I go to Frank, where I went for a walk with him. The Germans have attacked Denmark and Norway. A nice birthday treat. I went with Frank to the coffee shop, where we had ice cream, 2 rolls with butter each, and a pot of tea. Then we went to the movie theatre, where we saw The Stars Look Down. I got a letter from parents, from Frank writing paper, a fountain pen, and ink." And quote. And I should mention here that Frank is actually Fritz, who anglicized his name at some point during his time in England. But notice how Paul weaves war news into his birthday activities with the same matter-of-fact tone. Actually, his sarcastic comment about the Germans attacking Queen Elizabeth's birthday tree is one of the rare emotional expressions we see in his entry. Most entries are simple records of daily events, football scores, etc. For Kurt, war updates have become just another part of his routine, alongside getting ice cream and going to the cinema. His writing shows how these young refugees learned to balance the weight of wild events with simple pleasures of childhood in their entries. These diary entries reveal how young refugees develop strategies of incorporating wartime reality into their daily lives, whether it's describing air raids, noting invasion reports, or other things. So, to conclude, the 5 key aspects we've examined today, diary writing practices, expressions of belonging, use of memory, language choices, and the documentation of everyday life, reveal how Kindertransport refugees actively engaged in complex processes of life-making through their writing. Rather than seeing these elements in isolation, we can understand them as interwoven threads in the fabric of adaptation and identity formation in exile. Diary writing itself served as both a method and medium for processing displacement. The very fact of maintaining a diary provided continuity and disruption, but also creating a space where young refugees could experiment with different ways of expressing themselves and understanding their experiences. Whether addressing their diaries as confidants and friends or using them as factual records, these children found in writing a tool for maintaining agency and narrating their experiences in exile. The question of belonging emerges as a particularly complex one through these diaries. Rather than showing a simple progression from an old home to a new one, the entries reveal ongoing negotiations between multiple forms of belonging, not just geographical. Through writing, these diaries show that the young refugees crafted what we might call hybrid belonging, ways of being that could encompass both national and spatial belonging, but also cultural and linguistic forms. Memory plays a fascinating role in this process too. Rather than serving purely a nostalgic purpose, memories in these diaries function as a reference point for understanding new experiences. When diarists compare English swimming pools to Viennese ones, they weren't simply expressing longing for the past. Instead, they were actively using memory as a tool for making sense of their present circumstances. Language usage in the diaries reveals strategies for navigating between worlds. The gradual incorporation of English words, the maintenance of German, and the development of hybrid forms all show how these young writers were not simply learning a new language, but developing new ways of expressing themselves. The documentation of everyday life proves particularly significant. With their recording of both ordinary moments, school days, meals, friendships, and extraordinary events like air raids and the evacuation, these young refugees were actively constructing new forms of normal. The matter-of-fact treatment of wartime events alongside typical teenage concerns shows not desensitization, but rather remarkable resilience, the ability to maintain ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances. Together, these elements reveal diary writing as a crucial tool in what we might call adaptive life making. These young refugees weren't simply recording their experiences, they were actively processing trauma, constructing new identities, and creating frameworks for understanding their situations. Most significantly, these diaries show us that the making of new lives wasn't a linear process of leaving one identity behind and adopting another one. Instead, it was a complex negotiation between past, present, and uncertain futures, between remembered homes and new ones, between old languages and new ones, between childhood security and wartime uncertainty. The diaries emerged not just as passive. The diarists emerged not just as passive victims of circumstances, but as active agents in their own life making, using writing to create coherence from chaos and meaning from displacement. This understanding has profound implications on how we think about refugee experiences, both historical and contemporary. It suggests that providing refugees with tools of self-expression and meaning-making, whether through writing or other means, isn't merely therapeutic, but fundamental to the process of building new lives. The Kindertransport diaries remind us that adaptation isn't just about physical safety or practical integration, but about maintaining agency in the face of displacement and finding ways to craft coherent narratives from fragmented experiences. These young writers show us that making new lives isn't about forgetting the old one, but about finding ways to weave together different threads of experience into something new, something that can acknowledge loss while embracing possibility, something that can hold both past and future in a meaningful present. Their diaries stand as a testament to both the challenge of displacement and the remarkable capacity of resilience and renewal through the act of writing. So these diaries challenge us to move beyond simple narratives of rescue and gratitude. They show us that the impact of displacement on young lives is both profound and nuanced, playing out not just in dramatic moments, but in the quiet daily experiences of life-making processes in a foreign land. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Monia, for those insights. Does anybody have any questions, please? Monia's happy to answer. Need a moment's pause to think, absorb it.
Being bilingual, did you find you make a concerted effort to read the source material in the original language or the ready and available translations? And if so, did that have any bearing on the impact of the diaries for you and the themes that you saw throughout?
There are actually no translations available. All these diaries are unpublished, so they're archive materials. So the translations that I used are my own translations. I think there's one diary that you can get a translation for in the Wiener Library. I think that's Ilse's diary, but I didn't look at it just because I didn't want to have that sort of cloud of judgment. But it is really interesting, sort of like when I was trying to translate these quotes into English, like how do you translate them? Not just like, put it in Google Translate, but you have to think about your own word choices to like sort of kind of keep the tone of the writing of the children in a way. And it made me appreciate the work of fiction translators, like literary translators, a lot more.
I have one, if I may.
Please.
I know that you drew a lot from the archives. Were you able to actually speak to anybody who had a diary and allowed you to look through it?
I've spoke to a couple of family members, but none of the diarists were alive when I started.
Mhm.
Well, I didn't reach out to them. I mean, I feel like in hindsight I should have done. So 2 of them were still alive, but they died in 2021 and 2022. So I never actually got to speak to them. But I didn't want to have that retrospective gaze, like asking them about the process. So I looked at some of their memoirs. And so in my thesis, I'm actually also referencing the memoirs and say, oh, isn't it interesting how they remember this differently, or they're using their diary to actually look at this and then they change things or reevaluate things differently. But I just didn't want to have that retrospective gaze, because that's what makes the diary so important and so fascinating, because it's literally like them just writing down and exactly.
Yes.
I mean, it's wonderful, like how you see Ilse's entry, for example, the day after the war was declared, when she's just sort of like rattling down things that happened since her last entry, and she's like 2 pages in. Oh, by the way, yeah, fascinating.
An observation and some questions. One of the things that struck me on the first few was the level of German was very erudite indeed. These were, to me, they did not come across as typical children, street urchins or whatever. These were highly educated children. The boy who got his diary at 11 on his 11th birthday, for example, he was a very good example of that. And the other thing I'd like to ask is, how often were these diaries completed? Every day, every week, every month? When was the start and when was the finish of most of them?
It varies. So yeah, I mean, some try to keep up some regularity. So Ilse's diary started in 1935. So I looked at 9 diaries. I think 3 of them were started before the Kindertransport. Just general like experiences of life. You can sort of see what's happening in the lead up, in the build up to the evacuation. Sometimes they write weekly, they don't write daily. I mean, Helga does. She sort of keeps her diary as a calendar/diary, so she like comments on daily activities. But then there's other ones that, write weekly. During summertime, you can always see that there's like a break in writing because they're doing other fun things. And then when something happens, like Elisabeth, for example, in the lead up to her boarding a ship to go to the US to join her parents again, she starts writing daily suddenly. Or again, like she got that letter saying, oh, are you writing in your diary? And then she's like, okay, I need to make an effort to write daily. And that sort of, she does that for 2 weeks and then it breaks off. And then sort of, so it really varies. But
and over a period of time, do you see a kind of progression?
I mean,
in their feelings and their thoughts and their attitudes?
Yeah, I think especially Ilse is quite a good example for this one. So we've seen that entry at the start of like sort of 5 months into her being in England, where she says, oh, I hate London and such stupid people, simple-minded. And then she gets to the point where she's like, oh, actually, no, I have friends now and I have my community. And then she gets progressively upset when she has to move and get sent to other places. So they do start adapting. You can really notice it with the language, I think. Like the German gets worse and worse progressively. And then like at some point or another, they completely switch into English. There's a couple of entries in Edith and in Elisabeth's diary and also in Ilse where they say, oh, I've forgotten all my German. So yeah. I mean, they say that they haven't, because then they sometimes like go back into German and say like sentences or something. So yeah, I mean, their writing abilities is actually fascinating because it's something like very literary. Elisabeth has also this really interesting entry where she says, oh, I really want to see the St. Stephen's Cathedral from Vienna. And I look out the window and there's this misty cloud around a church tower and I can feel myself being transported back to Vienna. And it's really fascinating, like how they can write at this age, really. Like I certainly wasn't able to write like this when I was 12. But yeah.
As regards what we might call Sprachinterferenz, where they're using English expressions, I think it may be possible to read too much into that. Having taken children to Germany myself, they'll say things like, oh, let's go and trinken, or I'm going to the sports centre to do some climbing. they'd latch on to little and these little phrases like "I'm fed up" or "can't be bothered." They appeal to children, I think.
Yeah, but I think that's what they pick up. That's just stuff that the way they want to express it. Like, I mean, we were discussing this earlier, like fed up is just a bit quicker, like rolls off the tongue a bit better than saying, "Oh, ich hab die Nase voll," or something. So it's just, they encounter phrases and expressions. And I noticed this certainly for myself when I first arrived in England. You pick up things that people say and then they suddenly start, even like not in my German speaking, but also in my English, like just sort of start weaving themselves in, and you start saying things that you didn't know existed before. So whilst you're right to say, oh, we shouldn't overemphasize this. At the same time, I think it just really shows that they are very
interesting. Yes, of course.
Hang on. I was wondering how many diaries you reviewed, and then obviously you selected around 9, is it?
Yeah.
And whether there were clear themes that kind of led you to choose those diaries in particular, or whether you kind of had to really dissect those themes out.
Well, so I looked at different ones. I think I made a conscious decision to just choose the ones that directly ended up in England. So I found a few where they were first in France, or they first arrived in Holland, and then they stayed in the Netherlands for a little bit. So I was like, okay, no, I just want to look at from Germany or Austria to England. I found a couple of Czech ones, but I don't speak Czech, so I obviously discounted those ones. And then I wanted to have sort of a bit of a breadth. So I wanted to have people different ages. I quite liked the idea of the brothers. I was also limited a bit by COVID, so I couldn't travel to the archives. So I needed to actually look like what was available online. So I started with the ones that were available and digitized, and then the ones that were in London. And then sort of, you just sort of start identifying and sort of look at different circumstances. It's really, really difficult. Like there's actually not that many diaries, more become available now. But yeah, I mean, again, COVID was a bit of a problem because a lot of archives pulled their holdings to digitize them. So I couldn't take them out, but they weren't digitized. Some still aren't. Some have become available now. So I feel like in the ideal world, I would have selected them a little bit more careful, or not more carefully, but more like had a bit more
to choose from.
Yeah, to choose from. But I'm pretty happy with the spread. I think I would have liked to have someone from Wales or someone from Scotland, but I just couldn't find any.
That's surprising. Yeah. I wanted to ask you mentioned the brother, and I wanted to ask you, if I may, also, was there anything reflected in the diaries about communications between brother, sister?
Yeah, no, definitely.
With the family?
Yeah, they quite, I mean, a lot of them came over with their siblings, actually, surprisingly, like out of the 9 diaries. Elisabeth had her brother who was placed somewhere else. They tried to place him somewhere close to her so they could visit each other. So they'd write, like she would write about, oh, he was here and we had a nice time. Fritz and Kurt also write about each other. I mean, we've seen in the one example that they met up for the birthday. Fritz says in one other entry, oh, I've just visited Kurt and his English is becoming better and better every time I see him. There's Ingeborg, whose brother was also here, but then he was sent to internment at some point to Canada. So she's like constantly writing about news from Canada. So they kept in touch, but a lot of them weren't. So Irene and Helga actually were the only ones who were placed together that I looked at. And they obviously had a quite strong bond.
In the correspondence and the diaries, does the brother or sister reflect, for example, the complaints and offloading, sharing to that sibling?
Not really. I think the older siblings are very conscious of not burdening their younger ones. So Fritz isn't really telling Kurt about. So Fritz is writing about his parents sending him letters about getting money for the passage to emigrate to. I think where did they go? Costa Rica or Ecuador or something. And Kurt never mentions that in his diary. So Fritz clearly not telling him, and he's sort of like, I'm burdened with this, but I'm the older brother, I have to. Similar with Edith, she's like, oh, mum and dad are asking me for this. But so I think there's like sort of we're together like here, and at least we're here, even if we don't live together. And I don't think there's any jealousy really coming through that one person had a better placement or something. Like it was just sort of like a general, I'm happy for my sibling.
Oh,
Who's going first? You go first. Oh, thank you. So maybe this is slightly unfair of a question, but partly because I guess you've modified this somewhat for a slightly more public audience. But I'm intrigued by the term ego document.
Yes.
yeah.
I'd love to know more. How, like, I kind of can sort of guess from ego and document, but I'd love to know how a concept like that fits into.
Well, I think, well, primarily it's a term that's been used a few times in this sort of discourse around diary writing, sort of like you do it for yourself. It's like an act of ego. I express myself in this diary. It's a document, obviously, so you've got these different aspects. I think I just quite like the term because it raises questions. Because it's, yes, okay, we write it like I'm writing my diary, which is a very private thing, but then a lot of them wrote it with the intention to share it at some point, like when you started, with your Kindertransport in, like as a starting point or something, you think maybe I'll be reunited with my parents and they can read it. So it is quite an interesting thing, but I did really want to just sort of use like the term that was used in the scholarship as well. And like, I feel like ego documents is a very loose term used in the scholarship, which is quite interesting because you've got letters are ego documents because is it as soon as I pick up a pen and I write something, is that then an ego document? Probably not, because I wrote this thesis. That's not an ego document. So yeah, is it something where you have your self-reflective practices? It's like a form of self-expression. So yeah, it's quite. But yeah, I discussed this in the thesis.
How many of the diarists end up settling in the UK permanently, and how many return to Germany?
None of them actually returned to Germany or Austria. I think now. So Ilse was the only person who stayed. Ilse and Hannah stayed, and then so Elisabeth obviously, as I said, joined her parents in Buffalo, and then Kurt and Fritz joined their parents in Ecuador. It's actually there's a whole discussion about how many of the Kindertransport refugees actually were reunited with their parents. It's a really sort of unknown figure. So we can't say completely, but Tony, correct me.
Well, the Kindertransport Association, which is affiliated to the AJR, carried out a very large survey of Kindertransportees about 20 years ago.
Yeah, they found something like 40%, I think.
Yes, the interesting thing is the number that responded. There were approximately 10,000 Kindertransport children that came here, and they had over 1,000 responses. So this is a very large sample. If you look at the samples for, say, polls for electoral purposes, they're normally a few thousand people. A big poll might be about 20,000 people, but that's a very tiny fraction of the total electorate in a country like this. So, for those of you who don't know, I worked for the AJR myself. I was the editor of its journal, monthly journal, for 12 years. So I'm not an impartial observer in this matter, and I also knew very well the people who the Kindertransportees in particular. They're all dead now. A man called Hermann Hirschberger, who was the principal mover behind the Kindertransport survey, and as I knew to my cost as editor, Hermann was a man who was very particular, and I take strong issue with people who did not know anything about the Kindertransport survey and who cast doubt on it. Obviously, it's not perfect.
No,
it's an indication.
It's more than an indication. it's more than an indication. It's very solid evidence.
Yeah, it's a
I'm sorry, I feel quite strongly on this
no,
point.
no, no, yeah. Absolutely.
Also, I mean, I have at least one Kindertransportee in my own family. You know, when I was growing up, and these assumptions that 90% of the Kindertransportees were never saw their parents again. I thought this was plainly, well, from my own experience, unlikely to be true. I mean, and in fact, I mean, it's well known. I mean, statistics on the number of Jews from Germany and from Austria that survived were well known soon after the war, and nothing like 90% of them died. So it's unlikely to be true. I mean, the Nazis didn't go around killing Kindertransport parents.
And I think a scholar just recently found like a whole list, Amy Williams, of the Kindertransport. So I think there's more chances now to actually track these families as well. So yeah, there's obviously lots of advancing, but yeah, like sort of a lot of them further migrated to join up with their families. I think.
They settled abroad.
Yes, yeah.
Got a couple.
After this question, I think Andrea Hammond would like to unmute.
Yeah, I think
And I think she has a question.
yeah, we'll do one.
That's yours.
I have a couple, but one can wait till later. You mentioned how, as the diaries like progressed, the kids start writing in English more and more. Later on in the diaries, when they do write in German and versus in English, is there like a pattern to why they choose either language?
Not really. I think there's just something that it's closer to them. I mean, most of them say, "Oh, it's an English language environment now." Like that sort of just switches. But some take it as an opportunity to just keep up their German. It's quite interesting. I think it's Edith who says, "Oh, I just wanted to detach myself from this." So she stopped writing German, and then like later on, like she does like I think it was in 1962, she writes like her last entry. So she finds her diary again, evidently, and then like sort of reads through it and it's like, oh, I can actually still read this and understand this. And actually, like, I'm really annoyed with myself that I didn't keep up my German now. So it is quite interesting. But you can see in the German entries, the later on they get, I think Ilse still writes in German in 1946, and her German sounds really English. It's just sentence structure and the way she writes and the words that she chooses. There's just something slightly off about it. And yeah, you can sort of tell that the environment that she finds herself in daily is different.
You had another question.
Yeah, I can go now if you want. I know the focus of this is very like language centric, but I can see on there and on some of the other pictures there are little drawings. Did you consider whether the drawings might have any significance?
Yeah, I have a whole subsection in my thesis on the materiality of the diaries. It was a conscious choice not to include this today because of copyright issues. Because I can't actually use the pictures of all the diaries. So these ones are available from the Holocaust Memorial Museum webpage, and like you can use them. But other diaries, like there's one that has really like sort of illustrations in, like she draws like her and her friend playing tennis, or her like being on a bike and stuff. So there's different things. Or like Kurt's diary is really interesting because he like includes newspaper clippings, postcards, and so there's this whole aspect of materiality and like how much care they actually take, and like it sort of just re-emphasizes diary writing as a practice, as something that conscious, where they actually sit down and take the time. And then, yeah, sort of weaves itself through the aspect of agency again. This one's quite interesting, Elisabeth's examples, because sometimes they match and sometimes they don't. So this is very Christmassy, but it says Easter Sunday. So it's just, and then like the next page, I think I showed that on a different slide. It had Easter bunnies on it, and I was like, okay, like, did she draw this beforehand, or did you do that on the day? Like, yeah, it's hard to say, but she comments on it in her memoir, and she's just sort of, or some pages, she just sort of had time and just started doodling in the margins, and then later on, she would sometimes do it on the same day as writing the entry. So it really depends there. And there's a whole chapter there. So I've got an online question. Yeah, I mean, please feel free to unmute and then ask.
Is that me or is it somebody else?
It's you.
Okay, hello. Yeah, I wanted to ask about language, I think.
Yes.
So I've come to this as a sort of as a stranger, but I've just started transcribing my uncle's Kindertransport diaries, which I've just got hold of because my father has died. And they're very like Kurt's. They're just, every day he starts by saying, I get up and I get dressed and I have breakfast, and after breakfast, and then it's very, very, very plain. And just somebody asked about this. They start on the boat. They came on a boat from Hamburg, and they end in 1941. He writes the date in November 1941, and then he doesn't write anything again.
Yeah.
There's another bit of a volume later, but they come in 10 volumes, and I think somebody had given him 10 identical books. Anyway, one of the things I find quite strange about it is that it's written entirely in the present tense, except when he's writing about when they go for a drive and they see things. So he'll write entirely in the present tense, and then he'll say, oh, and when we were on our drive, we went to all these places, and suddenly it's in the past tense. And and I saw this carving and this church, and it was wonderful. And it's only when he goes somewhere else and he's enthusiastic. Although when he's on the boat and he's enthusiastic about the food, which he's really keen on, he's still in the present tense. So it's really quite strange. And I was wondering if you'd come across anything like that. And as far as I can tell, he carries on in the present tense. He carries on in German right the way through. But I'm only in August, and they arrived in June. I mean, war hasn't broken yet, and I'm quite slow because my German's not brilliant.
I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, yeah, hopefully, you have fun translating them. No, I've come across something similar. I think it's partly an attempt to create immediacy. So, like, you're writing in a present, or like, I mean, Elisabeth does that a lot, where she just starts writing, and in the book does that as well, where she starts writing an entry and then she leaves and then comes back to the entry. So there's a potential that they actually, he gets up and he's like, I got up, or I get up, sort of lists the things he's done in the past half an hour or so in the present tense, and then sort of comes back to it and writes about it later. And obviously, clearly, if you go on a excursion, you can't write about it in present tense.
It does seem to be a bit like that. I mean, he clearly, there's an entry for every day, but I'm not clear that he writes it every day. And there is a point quite early on where he's actually writing 2 diaries, because there's a school competition for the best summer holiday diary. So he's now writing meine Tagebucher. And there's one in English, which we don't have.
Yeah.
We'll have to see whether it's different.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating.
Find it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like we can also see that in Leopold's entry that I mentioned earlier, where he like reflects on his last days in Germany, or well, not reflects, but like he writes them in the present, but they're clearly like months in the past. So it's probably a choice that you think, oh, I'm writing a diary, it's a daily thing. I need to actually like be in a writing present here, even if they sort of sit down and write 3 days at the same time. I think Kurt does that actually with his first entry. He's like, oh, today's the evacuation of the countryside, but then or to the countryside. And then he like goes on and on and on and on. And then suddenly he's like 3 days later. It's like, but like you didn't really say that this is a different entry. Like he's just sort of like, oh, it's like from September the 5th to September the 9th. And then he just sort of goes on. And you can't tell which day is which. And then, but yeah, so interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Andrea, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to. I found it. I mean, obviously, I've been sort of part of the process of writing this thesis, so that was quite interesting. But I would like to, I would like to ask whether you could make some more comments, like on the agency of the children, because that's also an aspect of the Kindertransport, is that sometimes people think it was something that happened to the children, and of course, this is true. And children didn't necessarily have a choice, and it obviously depends on the age. But in the diaries, I think there's a lot of evidence that people sort of reclaim the agency. Obviously, as I said, it does depend a little bit on the age of the child. So I was wondering
Can
whether
you just explain that Andrea is the former PhD supervisor of Monia,
Yeah, I mean, it's no
producer?
certainly there's a lot of agency. So I think, well, they didn't really have a choice whether they boarded the transport or not. So if you say like, oh, did they have agency in actually going on the Kindertransport, that's a whole debate in and on itself. But actually, especially with the older ones, and I mentioned this earlier a bit, they were just sort of roped into helping actively with immigration or like finding jobs. And I think this is where the inactivity comes in again. Like they wanted to do stuff and they were actively applying for work. Or there's this one brilliant entry where Ilse writes about the committee deciding that she has to move again. And then she's like, I've had enough of this. And then she marches down to the refugee committee and demands to speak to someone and says, I'm not having this. I'm not moving to Manchester. So it is quite visible in the entries of especially the older ones, sort of like 12, 13, 14, 15, that they actively did a lot of things like trying to help future people to raise money for their parents, passage to different countries or get their visas approved, that they wanted to work, wanted to contribute. I mean, there's different aspects of actively creating something, making sense of the refugee community, making sense of their everyday activities. I mean, they're constantly sort of doing things, even though there's obviously this aspect of inactivity. But I think these doing things, it's not just the agency of writing the diary itself, but it's just a lot of the time, like, like engage in these discussions about refugee, like the refugee reality, or helping my parents, or actively noting what's happening with the war, like even though these events are unfolding around them, but just them actually writing down saying this has happened, like Germany invaded this country, or the air raids are happening. Yes, they're happening around them, but like they're actively aware of this. And there's sort of a lot of levels of agency in these diaries, and it's quite fascinating. And it's really, really difficult actually to describe this unless you've read them through, I think, because you can really see how they're trying to do certain things and do different things, and like question their own belief systems because of things that are unfolding around them. There's one entry in Edith's diary where she says, oh, everyone was really happy that Russia has now joined the war, but that just means more bloodshed, and like I'm so like fed up with this, and I don't think God exists, and I'm going to reevaluate my whole norms and beliefs and values and everything. And that's sort of, I think, all expressions of agency in a way. And I think you can see that in most diary entries, actually, that there is just an active, like there's an active choice that they're making.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Oh,
No, it's fine. You go first.
I'm probably about to really out myself as a French scholar in disguise, but I felt lots of kind of resonances with the texts of the Renaissance philosopher Michel de Montaigne, who wrote loads and loads of essays about all sorts of things. But the thing that really sets them apart from other texts from the same period is that the further through writing them he goes, the more and more detached his writing becomes, until it's almost like another self that he then starts writing about learning things from. And also then goes back and rewrites bits of it and corrects it all in this kind of process of like what's really Pontzily called kind of the dialectic of selfhood, and like self-fashioning. And I'm intrigued as to how much of that sort of stuff is going on here? I mean, is there other examples of them going back and correcting previous texts, or saying that they've, other than the example that you gave of the Italian telephone kid going, "Oh my God, I'm so stupid." Examples of them rereading and then remembering things, and
Yeah, I mean, they don't actually really comment on the entries that they've written. So no, so they don't go back and correct them. Like that wouldn't happen. But there are instances, I mean, more so in Leopold's diary, because he's really like on this whole thing of like, and now reevaluate myself. And like it happens several times actually that he says, I've reread the last pages and I can't believe I said this. And it's quite interesting. But the other ones also say sort of like, oh, like this has happened and I need to now change this. Or I mean, it can be something as simple as personal relations. Like Elisabeth always complains about one of the foster siblings that she has. And then she's like, actually, coming to think of it, she's not that bad. And yeah, obviously like faced with different other issues. Again, Elisabeth is here a good example. When she leaves for Buffalo, she says, oh, I feel like looking back at it now, I'm so much closer to England than I thought I was. Even though I hate all of its people. There's a threat here. No, but yeah, I think they go back and write entries then and say, I've reread or I've looked at the pages again. And then a couple of them have concluding entries. So Edith has one, Elisabeth has one, Ilse has one that's like 5, 6, 10 years later, whatever, 20 years later, where they're like, oh, reread the diary and like, this has happened, this is me now. And then some of them go on to write memoirs, which is where they actively then say, I shouldn't have written, or like, I wish I would have said this instead of this.
Yeah. And in those diaries, I mean, because you kind of hinted at this in your talk, and again, it's another parallel, this is another kind of hot topic on Montaigne studies, is that there's this kind of tension between, on the one hand, making it look like this is just, I'm writing this for myself and it's all for me and it's just a study of me for me, and no one would ever read this. And on the other hand, you know, I intend for this to be consumed publicly at some point, or at least by my parents. Yeah. And so, like, what I'm also wondering is how much of that is like, how much does that tension come out? Is there any like, is it obvious that they're writing for others?
Yes and no. I think it comes through at different points. So I think Ilse has this moment of realization where she's like, I'm never going to see my family again, or at least like my mother, which she didn't. Like her dad survived, her mother didn't, but she had a troubled relationship with her father. So I think there's a moment of realization, and then she sort of, her writing is just very sort of personal, whereas like Ingeborg is really writing it with, I will share this, if not with my parents, with my brother. It also depends, like some diarists, I mean, Vera Gissing is a really good example for this, and she's published her diary. That's why I didn't look at it, because I wanted to look at unpublished diaries. But she says, my dad gave me this diary and said, write every day. We will read this when we're reunited. So it really depends. I mean, Elisabeth as well was obviously reminded by her nanny, sort of like, keep this diary, you know. So there is sometimes sort of like coming through, oh, I will share this, or there's a future reader in mind, but that future reader can also be a future self. Yeah. So it's a way of kind of mediating and presenting yourself, but also there's a form of immediacy there that they actually sort of just, for a lack of better expression, I say word vomit on the page and then sort of reevaluate later on.
So you'd say that there's a tangible change in the writing style of the one who realizes that her mum's not.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Cool.
I mean, it's really sad when you sort of read this, you know, and then, I mean, because she really like has this homesickness for her mother that I showed in one of the entries, but it keeps coming up, and she's like, I've really missed my mother. Edith is the same. They're like, oh, you know, I haven't heard from them in months, and yeah, letters are far and few between. Now they're coming from the Red Cross, so there's this real change, and obviously I know what's happening because I'm reading it years and years later with all the historical context and knowledge. They don't. and it's heartbreaking. And you can see how more and more desperate they become, but also kind of like to maintain a positivity. They're all fascinating. I mean, I would literally say like everyone goes to archives and read these diaries.
Yeah, we have a question here, and then if we could take one more, if that's all right with everybody. Daniel, we'll come back to you if we may. Please hold on. So please go ahead with your question.
So excuse my ignorance, and sorry if you covered this before, but the Kindertransport, this is my mum, we have family members that were on the Kindertransport, or one family member. And I guess that's warped my view of it being Jewish children. So was it just Jewish children? Was it also all Germans? And I guess in the diaries that you've read, I think it was clear that maybe one was Jewish. He spoke about guilt and Hitler boys marching. Was there different themes that you saw across Jewish children versus?
Yes and no. I mean, they're mainly Jewish children. I mean, after sort of the laws introduced by the Nazis, like who is Jewish and who isn't. Elisabeth actually is Catholic, but her mother was Jewish and then converted to Catholicism. Yeah, this is how you can notice. But and then obviously when she says she misses the Stephansdom in Vienna, that's also a Catholic church. So there's most of them were deemed Jewish, but some of them were not practicing. That's also a tension that was created by some placements that people from very sort of non-practicing Jewish families were sent to.
You spoke about reunion with parents.
Yeah.
And so like that would have never been an actuality for us. And I was like, oh, people were reunited with their parents. Like they survived Auschwitz, or like, how did they do this? But
I mean, a lot of them, I think, and again, I feel like you know a bit more about this, but I mean, I can see in some of the diaries that, like, obviously, I just said, like, they actively try to help their parents to get out and raise money, or like get funding from somewhere that they can pay for the visas, they can pay for the boats or whatever. So I think obviously it kind of helped having children at a certain age somewhere where they could try and support you. So it wasn't just an effort from the parents themselves. A lot of them also had I mean, a lot of the children that I looked at, and 9 isn't a huge sample size, but that's the whole point. Like, it's a very individual thing rather than an all-encompassing story. But a lot of them had family that had emigrated before to different places. So Helga had family in Sweden. Ingeborg had family that was already in London. So even though they couldn't live with them, they had sort of means and contact. So a lot of them were actually, reunited. And it wasn't like, everyone ended up in the concentration camps or work camps, but like some of them survived other ways, that they got out before it got too bad, but then the kids couldn't join them, and so it's very difficult. I mean, I think Kurt and Fritz weren't able to emigrate to like 1943 or something, just because the ship passage was too dangerous. Did I answer your question? Yeah, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much indeed for your insights. And
Thanks everyone for coming.
Very interesting.
Listening to me.
And thanks to Jane Lewin,
Yes.
who is behind the scenes but makes all these things possible, and to the university that we allowed for these wonderful facilities. Thank you very much for coming.